Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. My apologies, I was questioning the Secretary of State. It made me a little bit late to this hearing. But the committee is meeting today to examine the near-term and long-term homeland implications of the recent terrorist losses by ISIS, including the current state of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the heightened threat posed by the foreign fighter diaspora, the growing role of ISIS affiliates, and the significance of the virtual Caliphate. I'd like to take a moment to welcome also the newest member of our committee, Ms. Debbie Lesko, representing Arizona's 8th Congressional District. Welcome. It's good to see you. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 took the lives of almost 3,000 innocent people and left our nation in shock. In the aftermath, it was clear that serious changes needed to be made to keep our homeland safe. And while I believe we are safer today, terrorist threats persist. Terrorists and their followers are still killing innocent people and attempting to destroy our way of life. This has been made clear by the recent attacks against the West. London, Paris, Nice, Madrid, Manchester, Barcelona, Brussels, Berlin, and even New York have been targets of vehicle homicides, shootings, bombings, and stabbings. They are clearly following Sheikh Adnani's call to kill by whatever means necessary, wherever they are. And although many jihadists are resorting to small-scale attacks, the thwarted plot to take down an airliner in Australia last summer was a reminder that our aviation sector is still their crown jewel of targets. I continue to be concerned about the security at last point departure airports throughout the Middle East. Many of the world's most dangerous terrorists are only one plane ride away, and they will not halt their bloodthirsty campaign to take innocent life unless they are directly challenged. Fortunately, we have had some recent success on the battlefield. Our military victory over the so-called Caliphate in Iraq and Syria was a great achievement. However, there are remnants that remain in the Middle East and foreign fighters who have scattered throughout Europe and parts of Africa. A comprehensive strategy is needed so ISIS cannot rally, regroup, and rebuild from a new location. This strategy should address the root causes that breed terrorists, including a lack of economic opportunity and good governance structures. We must also keep our eye on al-Qaeda. In recent years, al-Qaeda has expanded its global presence and now is comprised of tens of thousands of fighters across 24 branches. They too want nothing more than a devastating attack against the West. Mitigating the terror threat from these groups has always been one of my top priorities. In my direction, we established multiple task forces to discover ways that we can prevent terrorist entry into the United States. As a result of their work, we strengthened the visa waiver program, enhanced our intelligence collection, and bolstered coordination to stop terrorist travel. Currently, we are examining ways that special interest aliens and potential foreign fighters are exploiting illicit pathways into our country from South and Central America. And just yesterday, ICE Director Thomas Homan confirmed to me that, quote, many known terrorists, unquote, are taking this path as well. America is facing threats from all directions. To keep our homeland safe, we need to be prepared to confront each one. So I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us. Each of you has served as or advised as America's top national security officials. And every member of this committee is grateful for your service to our nation, your time, and your expertise. I look forward to the discussion. And with that, I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses for their appearance today. Today, the committee is meeting to examine the threat posed by ISIS to America and the West. While ISIS has suffered significant losses in the wake of attacks by U.S.-led coalition forces under both the prior administration and the current one, the so-called Caliphate is not yet gone. Indeed, even as ISIS has lost territory funding, and fighters, its threats to the U.S. and our allies persist, albeit in new forms. As the so-called Caliphate has shrunk, you and I both know ISIS has turned to the virtual space and its affiliates and followers to recruit and radicalize new members around the world. Rather than planning or directing sophisticated attacks carried out by individuals traveling from overseas, ISIS can inspire lone wolves right here at home, online, with few resources and relative little effort. This more dispersed, asymmetrical threat will be harder for the U.S. and our allies to combat. It is essential for the Trump administration to ensure a careful, coordinated effort among all elements of our national security apparatus, military and intelligence assets, diplomats working with foreign partners, and Homeland Security officials at home. It remains to be seen whether this administration is up to the task. As members of Congress and members of the Committee on Homeland Security, our role will be to conduct close oversight of the Trump administration's effort. This is a critical juncture as the remnants of ISIS on the ground attempts to regroup and determine the future trajectory of the organization. As we have witnessed before, these groups do not disappear, but often morph into a new entity that poses new threats. Unfortunately, as the virtual space becomes increasingly important to ISIS, the organization's existing efforts to recruit and radicalize followers are only furthered by the Trump administration's rhetoric and policies. President Trump's own hateful words about Islam and Muslims lend credence to ISIS's message about the West. This kind of rhetoric also undermines our relationship with key partners abroad, jeopardizing essential information-sharing relationships. At the same time, the president's comments stoke fear and division among the American people, which is exactly the goal of terrorist organizations like ISIS. If President Trump's rhetoric has been harmful in this regard, his policies have been worse. From the Muslim travel bans to the Trump administration's almost exclusive focus on Islamic groups in its counterterrorism efforts, his policies have actually made us less safe. Today, I hope to hear from our witnesses about the future of ISIS and how the United States can best counter its threats to the homeland, both now and in the future, while upholding our American values. I appreciate the witnesses joining us today and look forward to your testimony. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ranking Member yields back. Other members are reminded opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us here today. First is probably the, when I think of ambassador, I think of Ryan Crocker. He is currently a diplomat in residence at Princeton University on leave of absence from Texas A&M. He has served in probably more hot spots than any ambassador I know. And I had the honor to be with him overseas in many of these locations and saw his service to his country. It's amazing to think, sir, you served in Lebanon when the Marines were killed in Beirut. You served in Syria when we had an ambassador in Syria. Served in Pakistan, served in Iraq, served in Kuwait, and then the last time I think I saw you overseas in Kandahar and Kabul in Afghanistan. Your service is really extraordinary as a diplomat, and I know that's why you received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award in 2009. Second witness we have is General Jack Keane. He's the president of GSI Consulting, serves as chairman of the board for the Institute for the Study of War. He has served as a 4-star general, completed 37 years of public service in December 2003, culminating in his appointment as the acting chief of staff and vice chief of staff to the United States Army. Since 2004, General Keane conducted frequent trips to Iraq and Afghanistan for senior defense officials with multiple visits during the surge period in both countries, and we thank you, sir, for your service as well. A third witness is Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, an expert on jihadist movements. He's also the chief executive officer of Valens Global, a fellow with Google's Jigsaw, an associate fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program. I've had the opportunity to visit with you in my office, and thank you for being here as well. The fourth and final witness is Dr. Joshua Geltzer, who is the founding executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, as well as visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Dr. Geltzer served from 2015 to 17 as senior director for the Counterterrorism at National Security Council, the NSC. And thank you, sir, also for being here. Your full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Ambassador Crocker for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee. It is a privilege to be here at this very important time, a moment at which, as both you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Thompson noted, that Islamic State is on the verge of military defeat. They have been defeated in Iraq, and we are in a mopping up mode now, I think, in Syria. So the hearing is very timely and is very important. It doesn't stop with the military defeat of ISIS, as you both have suggested. I have seen this movie before in part. I was in Iraq as ambassador from 2007 to 2009 at the time of the surge. And at a time when the horrific bloodshed in that country was wound down as the surge took effect, but especially as the political surge, if you will, took effect. The efforts to bring different Iraqi leaders together for a common cause. So as we look at Islamic State on down the road here, I think it's very important not to believe that because they were defeated on the field, they've gone away. Islamic State's predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was of course something that General Petraeus and later General Odierno, as well as myself, were fully focused on. But even at the height of the surge, we knew we had not completely eliminated them. Little pockets in Mosul, little pockets up the Euphrates River Valley. And it is, of course, in the Euphrates River Valley that we are operating with our allies today to try and destroy that presence. But even then, even when we have no more military targets, we will still have an adversary. That's what Al-Qaeda in Iraq showed us. They went to ground and they waited for better days. Better days for them, of course, came with the beginning of the Arab Spring, particularly in Syria. So that is what we will see, I am ready to predict, with Islamic State. Because ultimately, Islamic State is itself not the problem. It's the symptom of the problem. And you, Mr. Chairman, I think got this exactly right. The lack of good governance in this region has given the space for groups such as Al-Qaeda, such as Hezbollah back in Lebanon at a time I was there, and of course for Islamic State. So unless these governance issues are addressed, the problem will still be there. And we will see another manifestation somewhere down the road. Maybe it will use Islamist language, maybe it won't. We don't know. We do know that the failure of governance is going to create space unless or until those problems of governance are addressed. And I would say one thing here briefly about the United States. We're in a 100-year cycle now, more or less, of momentous events related to the First World War. In the peace after the First World War, we were basically not present. The British and the French were quite ready to administer the Middle Eastern lands of the former Ottoman Empire. They did not really want to see us there. And in any case, with the Senate in 1918 making it clear it was not going to ratify our membership in the League of Nations, we had no role to play. After World War II, it was completely different. We designed the post-war order. San Francisco Conference gave us the United Nations, Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Order, and not only did we create it, we led it. We led it for almost 70 years. Beginning in 2009, we saw a shift. Should the U.S. play that role, or should it not? Those questions were asked then. Those questions are being asked today. I would say, from my perspective as a foreign policy national security professional, while it was an imperfect order, that we would be wise to work to preserve it, an order that we continue to lead, because the world pretty clearly is not ready to lead or come together without us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Chair recognizes General King for his opening statement.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here today with my esteemed colleagues, particularly my friend here, Ambassador Crocker, America's most accomplished Middle East envoy. In the summer of 2012, the Islamic State of Iraq, then an al-Qaeda affiliate under the command of al-Baghdadi, was operating in the shadows around Baghdad when he made the most critical decision in his reign as a jihadist leader. He seized the opportunity to take advantage of the stalemated Syrian civil war. Al-Baghdadi correctly assumed that the civil war participants, largely fighting in western Syria, would be so preoccupied that he could occupy Sunni Arab territory in northeastern Syria with little resistance and establish a bona fide safe haven with several hundred fighters, mostly Iraqis. Al-Baghdadi grew the organization to 30,000 fighters in 18 months, invading Iraq in January 2014 by seizing Fallujah. In June, they captured Mosul, gained worldwide attention by forcing the collapse of the Iraqi army. The exponential growth of ISIS in less than 2 years, using the internet exclusively to recruit with sophisticated cinematography and messaging, was a remarkable historic achievement. With the eventual defeat of ISIS some 3 years later, in terms of retaking territory that was lost in 2017 in Iraq and also in Raqqa, Syria, the ISIS Caliphate was decimated, losing 90% of its territory and reduced to several thousand fighters in Iraq and Syria combined. ISIS is badly damaged, but it is not defeated, as the chairman and ranking member have mentioned. And it is still capable of insurgency and its ability to inspire others to engage terrorist attacks. Indeed, ISIS is still a thriving global terrorist organization. The virtual ISIS Caliphate maintains the connectivity with ISIS affiliate organizations worldwide. ISIS uses it also to help maintain its external terrorist organization and to direct or support network cells and individuals, but mostly to inspire others to kill and maim their own people. The virtual caliphate, after a considerable amount of effort, has finally been damaged, mainly because of physical destruction due to combat operations, but also due to offensive cyber operations that the United States has conducted. Further, the United States government has enlisted the assistance of social media such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to identify potential terrorist accounts and remove violent content from their platforms. In protecting the homeland, the best defense since 9/11 is still a good offense. The United States and coalition partners deployed to fight terrorists in their breeding grounds overseas. U.S. law enforcement agencies at home have remained vigilant in thwarting terrorist plots. as demonstrated by the fact that there still has not been a major terrorist attack since 9/11. However, despite law enforcement's best efforts, preventing inspired assailants from carrying out terrorist attacks remains a relentless challenge, as we experienced 3 attacks since 2015 in San Bernardino, Orlando, and New York. It is virtually impossible to monitor every one of interest, which means we need the assistance of an informed population to report suspicious behavior. In looking ahead, despite the success to date over ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the remaining ISIS fighters and leadership should be driven out of southeastern Syria along the Euphrates River Valley. And the Iraqi security forces, assisted by the United States and coalition partners, must maintain its vigilance in Iraq to prevent a resurgence of ISIS. Key is the formation of a government in Iraq after this recent election that enfranchises the Sunnis and the Kurds and does not make the mistake of previous Iraq governments that disenfranchised the Sunnis. Political unity is vital to prevent the rise of ISIS again or another radical Islamist group. It appears likely that ISIS will resort to traditional terrorist tactics and attempt to exert control in weakly governed space across Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. It will always be seeking sanctuary or safe haven, and when they do, it must be rapidly destroyed. Europe, more vulnerable than us, could be the next battlefront as ISIS activates and motivates followers to carry out attacks and prove it's still a threat to the West. In conclusion, there is an understandable desire to declare victory over ISIS after retaking the lost territory in Iraq and Syria and go home. In my view, that's a serious strategic blunder. The lesson learned from the premature withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, before political stability was achieved, is we got ISIS as a result. Similarly, we refused to assist the newly elected moderate government in Libya after Gaddafi was deposed in 2011, and we got Benghazi in 2012, and a failed state shortly thereafter. When we stay post-conflict to ensure political stability, as in Germany, Italy, and Japan post-World War II, in South Korea post-Korean War, and in Bosnia-Herzegovina for almost 9 years, significant and lasting success is achieved. The United States, our allies and partners, know we are in a generational struggle in confronting the ISIS threat and, in general, radical Islam, where the key to long-term success is defeating their ideology and certainly their propaganda, as well as addressing the conditions that help spread it, such as political and social injustice, lack of economic opportunity, corruption, and governance instability. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Chair recognizes Dr. Gardenstein-Ross.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members, it's an honor to be here to discuss this important topic at this vital time. We have agreement in all of the opening statements thus far that the territorial collapse of ISIS does not, of course, mean the end of the threat that the organization poses. What I want to focus on in this statement is the role of technology. Because when we look at the rising threat level against Western states, including the United States, technological developments and geopolitics have been the 2 key factors over the past several years. And we've seen 3 key developments that largely blindsided us. The first of these was just a few years after the 2011 Arab Spring Revolution, in which we saw social media mobilization bring very idealistic protesters out to the streets. We then saw social media mobilization used for much more nefarious purposes, as ISIS was able to draw, through both physical networks but also virtual networks, a record number of foreign fighters to the Syria and Iraq theater. Just a few years after that, we saw a major iteration in the way terrorism occurs, something which I call the virtual planner model. This is terrorist groups taking advantage of the intersection of both social media accessibility to operatives throughout the world and also the boom in end-to-end encryption, which allows them to talk to more people and to do so in secure ways. In this manner, terrorist networks half a world away can perform all the functions that physical networks used to perform: scouting for operatives, recruiting them, helping to select the target and timing of attacks, even providing various kinds of technical assistance, bomb-making assistance and the like. This has been a major development which has had a transformative impact on terrorism. In recent years and months, we've also seen the widespread adoption of consumer drone technology work to the advantage of militant organizations. We have, of course, seen that in Iraq and Syria. I can tell you for a fact that the weaponization of drones has already made its way to Africa. I was recently in Tunisia and got to talk to members of the African Union Peacekeeping Force who've seen Shabab in Somalia pick up drone technology. In all of these cases, we see a clear pattern, which is something is widely adopted by consumers, and then it's taken by terrorists and adapted in a way that can serve their purposes. I think that we need to stay apprised of this, because when you look at the homeland security implications of the continued threat posed by ISIS, their adoption of technology and use of consumer-oriented technology is going to be absolutely critical and something we need to stay ahead of. Now, in terms of what we can do, one thing that we need to maintain at a government level is dialogue with leading tech firms. That's an area where over the course of the past 3 to 4 years, especially with ISIS's exploitation of social media technology, there's been much more liaison between the U.S. government and tech firms in such a way that they're now somewhat speaking the same language. Secondly, getting out ahead of technological uses that can be exploited by terrorists is important. This is something we've had a hard time doing, in part because often we're blindsided by these adoptions of technology. One thing I highlight both in my written statement and also in some of my recent popular press writing is that artificial intelligence is likely to be an area in which terrorists are able to exploit the more widespread adoption of artificial intelligence at a consumer level. Finally, in terms of what we can do, I think that a lot will require international cooperation. When you see, for example, AI researchers arguing for international covenants to prevent automated weapons from being adopted widespread, whether you agree with them or not on the issue, one of the reasons why they're doing this is because they believe that proliferation of automated weapons systems will help rogue states and will help terrorist organizations. I think thinking about what's needed at an international level is very important, as well as harnessing the potential of current technological developments, including for such things as counter-network warfare. For us, technology is not a panacea, it's simply a tool. And I think that Ambassador Crocker puts his finger on the right question. Are we going to lead? And it's not just a matter of our will to lead, but all the technological developments I've put my finger on have really changed the way that so many spheres do business, including especially in the entrepreneurial space. But it has that impact in the government and politics sphere. Within my organizations, we often think of violent non-state actors as the equivalent of startup firms in the political organizing space. These organizations tend to be very good organizationally at what we're not good at. So asking the question not just about our will, but also our organizational design is, in my view, vital. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I'd like to mention that this committee will be, I'll be introducing an unmanned aerial system bill that I hope to mark up out of this committee. And thank you for mentioning technology. Dr. Gelster is recognized.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee. It's an honor to do so, especially alongside such distinguished witnesses. ISIS's so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria is shriveling, but it is not gone. The threat posed by ISIS persists and is evolving into new forms as ISIS adapts to the loss of its core territorial safe haven. I want to focus for now on 3 particular causes for concern about the threat posed by ISIS today: its continuing hold on territory, its persistent foothold on the internet to recruit and radicalize followers, and its potential turn to novel forms of cyber terrorism. Regrettably, elements of the Trump administration's approach to all 3 aspects of today's ISIS threat appear to be aggravating that threat rather than minimizing it. The encouraging fact that we are even considering what threat ISIS will pose post-Caliphate is a testament to both the Obama and Trump administrations' relentless execution of the counter-ISIS campaign in Iraq and Syria. But the last mile of defeating a terrorist group can be the hardest one. That is a lesson, as others have acknowledged already, that the United States learned all too well from the remnants of ISIS's predecessor, al-Qaeda in Iraq. Today, thousands of ISIS fighters appear to be enjoying a worrisome opportunity to regroup, partly because the United States has been unable to keep in the fight against ISIS our key counterterrorism partner on the ground, the Syrian Kurds. That setback reflects the Trump administration's inability to manage a delicate diplomatic balance between the Kurds and the Turkish government. So long as the Kurds remain occupied with defending themselves against Turkey rather than pursuing ISIS, the group is likely to retain territorial safe haven from which to plot against us and will continue to lay claim to a purported caliphate, the rallying cry for ISIS's continued recruitment efforts via the internet. That points toward the second aspect of ISIS's persistent threat, the group's use of social media, file upload sites, and other modern communications platforms to radicalize and mobilize followers worldwide. ISIS's online messaging has multiple themes, and if battlefield losses force the group to shift away from messages emphasizing the holding of territory, the group can pivot toward its claim to victimhood. Unfortunately, ISIS's internet-enabled message has resonated even here in the United States, with individuals such as Omar Mateen in Orlando and Saifullah Saipov in New York. With territorial holdings dwindling, ISIS's virtual foothold may increase in importance to the group. That is particularly concerning in light of aggravating factors for radicalization of the Trump administration's own making. Donald Trump, as a presidential candidate and now as president, has spoken about Islam and Muslims in ways that validate ISIS's attempt to portray the United States as waging war on a religion and its people. Moreover, President Trump has pursued policies that further alienate key communities whose cooperation is vital to identifying those who might be vulnerable to ISIS's appeal and to intervening before such individuals turn to violence. Those policies include imposing a travel ban that bears little relation to any real threats but offends key communities and foreign partners alike. And those policies also include withdrawing previously awarded grants to organizations dedicated to addressing white supremacists' brand of violent extremism, giving the distinct impression that the Trump administration is interested in countering terrorism only when it is carried out by groups purporting to act in the name of Islam. Thus far, radicalization has been ISIS's primary use of the internet, but that may change as ISIS loses physical territory and looks to new forms of cyber terrorism. Such efforts would build on earlier ISIS cyber activities, such as the theft and public release of personally identifiable information about U.S. service members. In the years since, malicious cyber activity has dramatically increased, with powerful hacking tools more readily available to non-state actors such as ISIS. Here, too, there's cause for concern that the Trump administration is not appropriately tackling the challenge. The top position overseeing cyber policy at the White House is vacant, and the next most senior cyber position was recently eliminated. If ISIS turns to new types of cyber operations to regain momentum and inflict harm, this lack of leadership to provide strategic guidance and interagency coordination may prove a serious vulnerability. The crumbling of ISIS's caliphate in Iraq and Syria is a major positive development for U.S. national security, but it's not the end of the threat posed by ISIS. With some physical territory still under its control, a virtual foothold on the internet still in place, and the potential to turn to novel forms of cyber terrorism, ISIS represents a continuing danger to Americans at home and abroad. All of this would be challenging enough, but the challenge is compounded by aggravating factors of the Trump administration's own making. I am grateful for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to the committee's questions.
Yeah, I want to thank the witnesses for your opening statements. I recognize myself for questions. I remember 2014 to 2016, my threat briefings, the ones that this committee had were, for lack of a better word, intense. External operations were being talked about almost on a weekly basis. We were arresting ISIS not only abroad, but in this country almost on a weekly basis. That has actually calmed down a little bit. I was in Paris and Brussels before they were hit. warning them about the lack of sharing vital intelligence, lack of knowing the manifest on airplanes, and then they were hit shortly thereafter. And then a new threat emerged, and it was the internet. A man by the name of Junaid Hussain from the UK. He was in Syria, and I was down at CENTCOM looking at the internet cafe out of which he operated, and we finally were able to take him out, and that internet activity went down. But that became the power and the global outreach of the jihad movement through Junaid Hussain. But then by the end of 2017, even though they had gained territory the size of the UK, by the end of 2017, they lost over 90% of their territory. And I will tell you the threat briefings, while I'm still very concerned, I do think the tempo and the pace has gone down. But I do think the threat does remain as they have retreated into the Euphrates River Valley. They are still in the Middle East, and they're also in northern Africa, places like Libya, Tunisia, Sinai in Egypt, and the Sahel in the middle of Africa, and also Southeast Asia. And my first question I want to direct to the ambassador and the general, because you've been there in service for so long, and it's almost a foreign policy question in a way, is this the post-Caliphate strategy. I think, the previous administration, we always hear the phrase leading from behind, but they're not making a decision is a decision in and of itself, and drawing red lines and allowing them to be crossed is a decision, and allowing countries like Russia to then come in to Syria, allowing Iran to establish a Shia crescent to Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen. So now we have Iran in Iraq and Syria. We have the Russians back for the first time since 1979 when they were in Afghanistan. We've got the Saudis. We have Israel launching rockets into Syria. One of the biggest crises, sort of civil war, conflict, refugee problems of our lifetime in some respects. Not to mention Turkey now fighting the very forces that we fought with to defeat ISIS. This is perhaps the most complex and challenging foreign policy crisis I think that we have had. Can you make any sense out of this? And what would be your focus and your strategy looking at the post-Caliphate Iraq and Syria?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You have summarized an impossibly complex situation very neatly. It is hugely complex. I spent more years of my life than I care to remember experiencing Lebanon's civil war. In its hot phase, that lasted 15 years. And it ended in 1990 only when the Syrian army occupied the presidential palace outside of Beirut and forced Michel Aoun into sanctuary in the French embassy. That would be the same Michel Aoun who is now running the country. In Syria, the list of players is far longer than it ever was in Lebanon. You've mentioned some of them: the United States, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, to name a few. Inside Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Free Army, the YPG, Al-Qaeda, obviously, Islamic State, Ahrar al-Sham, and again, we can go on. Why is this important? We saw why several months ago. The Iranians, I guess having a slow afternoon, decided they would put a drone over Israel and see what happened. Well, the Israelis shot it down and then retaliated with airstrikes. But they lost a plane. First time since 1985. Fortunately, that plane crashed in Israel and both crew members survived. Had it been otherwise, we could now be in a massive regional conflict. everybody kind of took a step back because nobody wanted that war then. But nobody wanted World War I either. So when an obscure archduke was assassinated in an even more obscure city, those were the guns of August. I've dusted off my copy of the book by that name, Barbara Tuchman. It's worth taking a look at now in the Syria context. So this is highly dangerous. We cannot settle it militarily, but we need to be in concert with all of our friends and allies talking about a problem that can blow the lid off the region and beyond. We need to stay engaged.
Thank you. And my time is just about expired. I do want to give General King at least a minute to respond, because as I see it, and Assad's never been more powerful now, backed by the Iranians and the Russians, and he's using chemical weapons. And, you know, it's like the biblical sense of all roads lead to Damascus. Can you make any sense out of this and what we should do moving forward?
Yeah, I really think the strategic imperative for the United States dealing with the Middle East is the hegemonic objectives that Iran has in imposing their will on the Middle East and to dominate and influence and control it. They've had some significant success in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and now in Yemen. And they're certainly just recently, as mentioned, encroaching on Israel, which has always been a strategic objective for them. At a minimum, put enough pressure on Israel as Iran will eventually try to develop a nuclear weapon, that Israel will not respond militarily, because the Iranians would have rockets and missiles fired at Israel from Lebanon and also from bases in Syria, which they're trying to do right now. I don't know how you approach that problem of a major aggressor like that, who's applying resources and achieving success without doing that as a multilateral approach. I felt for a long time that we need a sort of Arab NATO in the Middle East, a political and military alliance that works so well and stand it up against another ideology in the 20th century, that we need to approach this problem comprehensively in the Middle East. And it's not just about using military weapons. It's the whole entire spectrum that a political, economic, diplomatic, and military alliance would bring to that problem. Secondly, of course, is the breeding ground for radical Islam. And again, to approach that problem, we have to be organized for it. We have to undermine their ideology and propaganda. And we have to encourage our allies in that region to move in the right directions in terms of moving away from the conditions that are so paramount and set the stage for people the ability to recruit. I'm talking about what I said in my statement in terms of lack of political and social justice, lack of economic opportunity, the instability by poor governance, et cetera. It's a major problem. The one thing I do know, Mr. Chairman, and I've had this discussion with the administration, to wash our hands of this and to walk away because, one, we've lost thousands of soldiers there, two, we've spent a lot of money there, and three, there may be a lack of political will in the country, it'd be a huge strategic mistake. The Middle East cannot explode. If we let that explode, it'll harm the United States in terms of our own security of our people and also those of our allies and our national interests as well.
Thank you, and I completely agree with you. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you very much. Both answers were to the chairman's question quite illuminating. The one thing that I'd want a conversation with Ambassador in general on this, to what degree will budget cuts for the State Department and other impact your response that you just made to the chairman?
Thanks very much for that critical question, sir. The 31% budget cut that was proposed for the State Department and which then Secretary Tillerson saw fit not to oppose would have crippled the Department and the Foreign Service for years to come. Damage has been done already. We took in about 100 new officers in calendar 2017. The year before, it was 370. We need to promote about 100 officers a year into the senior Foreign Service. Last year, we promoted 47. So this is creating a structural problem we will wrestle with for years to come. And as we face this enormously complex threat and fight, to do that with a weakened Foreign Service is not protecting our national security. You know, we're the ones who are forward. We are more expeditionary than the Marines even. That's why it's called the Foreign Service. We know the cultures, we know the languages. Every Foreign Service officer is fluent in at least one foreign language. But we have almost been decimated. And I'm very pleased to see that Secretary Pompeo realized that from day one and has already taken steps to undo some of the damage by the previous secretary with his ending of the hiring freeze. There is more to be done. Listening to his statements, I'm confident he will try to get that accomplished. But this is not the time to weaken the diplomatic side of this fight. And if there's anything I learned in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, there are no purely military tracks. There are no purely diplomatic tracks. They're all fused together. If you weaken the diplomatic part of the triad, you are heading for trouble, and trouble in this instance would mean a threat to our national security.
Thank you. Joan, you have some comments?
Yeah, just quickly. I agree with Secretary Mattis, who believes in a strong Department of State, and we only have several thousand diplomats. It's actually a very small service that we have, and we clearly have to reinforce it. And the thought of reducing the State Department's budget is ludicrous. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. If anything, we should be increasing it. You know, when the budget numbers from OMB are presented to the Department of Defense, that begins the negotiations. We never accept those numbers. We fight like the daylights to make sure that the budget is what it should be. From inside the executive branch, when the State Department gets a budget, and I know this from having spoken to them from OMB, they just accept it. The reality is they are underfunded and they are undermanned, and we cannot reduce this capability. They work hand in glove with the military. They keep us out of fighting wars. But the United States military can strengthen a diplomatic hand when we have a credible deterrence, as we've seen around the world. So totally agree with your sentiments, Ranking Member.
Thank you very much. Dr. Garnstein-Ross, you talked about in this effort to defeat ISIS that we're going to have to lead. And Ambassador talked a little bit about that too. But everyone seemed to agree that the new frontier is around technology and the ability to recruit and do other things. Are there some things that you think we should be doing as Congress to fortify that new frontier?
Thanks for that great question, sir. I do. I think the most important thing that Congress could do is to take a strong look at the acquisition process. You know, there's multiple areas in which the U.S. government has been trying to make the acquisition process more efficient and faster. Efforts like DIUX and some of the special operations branches retooling of their budgetary processes is important, because right now, you know, everyone who is around government knows that often the U.S. government ends up not getting the product that it wants. It ends up overpaying for an inferior service, and for most private sector firms, if they were run this way, they'd be out of business fairly quickly. For technology, with things moving as quickly as they are, I think we can't afford, not just for terrorism, but also for the great power competition that we now have with both China and Russia, to be significantly behind in this race. And when it comes to things ranging from surveillance and the ability of the Chinese government in particular to spy on us, to artificial intelligence, which we're right now, I think, falling behind in. There's a real need for the U.S. government to be able to acquire private sector expertise and private sector research in a way that is efficient and in a way that can ensure that it gets the product and the quality that it wants.
Thank you. Dr. Gitt, can you comment on that?
Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Ranking Member. I think that tech companies are in some ways on the front lines of this fight, but I think there's a real role for Congress in pushing them to do more. They've taken some steps for which they deserve credit. If you go back a little over a year ago, some of the major companies agreed on what they called a hash sharing coalition. So pieces of terrorism-related content that any one company in the coalition identifies now get shared with the other companies to see if those companies deem them to violate their own terms of service. That was a step forward. 6 months after that, the same companies agreed to share the tools that they use to find those types of content. That was a step forward. I think there are more steps forward that can and should come. For example, one might ask the tech companies, instead of just sharing the pieces of content, why not share the information associated with those pieces of content and with the accounts associated with the content? In other words, if a piece of content has been uploaded to one platform by an account and is deemed to have broken its terrorism-related terms of service, maybe another company has an account created by the same email address or otherwise affiliated with it that has uploaded terrorism-related information or messages as well. That would be a step forward, playing with artificial intelligence even to try to identify, based on past terrorism-related pieces of content or accounts, future ones before they're even uploaded to see whether in fact they should be or whether they violate terms of service on terrorism-related grounds. That could be a step forward. So I think Congress has a role to play, especially as tech companies find themselves on the Hill sometimes these days, asking those sorts of questions and asking what comes next.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Let me just echo the ranking member's sentiments and the panel on the, I had a dinner at the Marine Barracks with Secretary Mattis, and he talks about if you cut diplomats, you're going to have to buy more bullets. And I think his job is he said it, is put maximum pressure so the diplomats can do their job. And so just want to reinforce that point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. General, we talked about, you made a statement about we regained most of the territory in Iraq and Syria that the foreign fighters had occupied. But as those foreign fighters are being pushed out, they're moving into Africa and Asia. We've noticed that they've been pretty resourceful at moving around Western Europe, and they continue to plot to get into the United States to execute attacks. Do you foresee those foreign fighters, as they move into these regions, executing attacks from there, or trying just to focus their energies to move back into the Middle East and try to retake territory?
No, I don't see them going back into Iraq and Syria. But I do see some of those foreign fighters, a few thousand of them have returned to Europe, and certainly they're potential terrorist operations for sure. Others have moved to other affiliate organizations that are ISIS-supported organizations in Libya, in Tunisia, in the Sahel, in the Sinai. So there's plenty of opportunity for them to. Once they've committed to that ideology, usually they don't separate themselves from it. Usually death is what separates them from it. So regaining the Caliphate or some semblance of it would only happen if we walk away. If the political situation in Iraq does not enfranchise the Sunnis, then you have a potential rise again of a radical Islamist organization. In Syria, we've just got to finish what we've started and recognize that it's not over and continue to clean the remnants of that out. If we don't, if we pull away from eastern Syria, then the leadership is still there. They'll they'll certainly try to resurge and regain some smaller safe haven, and that would draw foreign fighters if that happened. That's the only situation that I see that would bring back their return. But they're operating in other areas, supporting movements in other countries as we speak, and also hiding in the shadows in Europe, waiting for an opportunity.
An opportunity to do what? To bring down Western civilization?
No.
while they're-
To conduct individual terrorist attacks, or to try to form a cell or larger
To what end?
network. Certainly, what their objectives are, yes, the goal of radical Islamist movements, whether it's Al-Qaeda or whether it's ISIS, does have a global objective to it. Replace Western civilization, much more than that, to dominate world civilization and undermine the international order as we currently know it. And that has been their aspiration, from the beginning.
Ambassador, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, I'm particularly concerned about the large number of them in Western Europe, but obviously here too. But what do you think is going on?
Well, thank you, Congressman. In a sense, the most dangerous period in terms of our own national security may be approaching, and it will come with the overt military defeat of Islamic State. Their ideology, as you know, had always been that the Caliphate was critical. They are now losing the last traces of that physical Caliphate. So they're going to have to develop a new ideology to justify their existence. So I would think that that's the moment when they will put all they have, wherever they are, into figuring out how they can do their version of 9/11. They couldn't hold territory in the field. I think the next step will be for them to do everything they can from wherever they can stage it to show that they can hit back and hit back hard within our homeland and within the European homelands.
Do you think we're doing enough in concert with our European allies to prepare for that or anticipate that?
I don't really have visibility on specific actions. My sense is that, and again, indeed, this committee would know far more, is that the administration, as was the case with the previous administration, takes this very, very seriously. I would say, though, we like to talk about intelligence failures. And certainly there are intelligence failures. But the failures that hurt us the most are failures of imagination. We couldn't imagine the 9/11 attacks. We couldn't imagine the destruction of the Marine barracks in Beirut and the death of 241 Marines, beyond our imagination. So I would hope that in the skunk works of the administration, there are some really bright people doing that kind of imagining. If we expect to get it all through intelligence, we won't. We can't. And again, the failure of the future that we may be holding endless hearings on would be just that, a failure of imagination with respect to a committed enemy.
Thank you, ma'am. My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today, and in particular, Ambassador Crocker and General Keane, thank you for your service to the country. Dr. Gardenstein-Ross, let me start with you, if I could, on the issue of drones. You described in your testimony ISIL's extensive weaponization of commercial drone technology, and I'm certainly very concerned, as the chairman is, about the possibility of drone-based terrorism, including domestically. And I've worked with my colleague, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, on legislation criminalizing the reckless operation of drones. Are you concerned that ISIL might aid or inspire someone in the U.S. To use a drone to carry out a violent attack? And what more can we be doing to prevent this kind of an action?
Sir, that's a great question. Yes, I definitely am concerned. And the major reason for my concern is that we're seeing major leaps forward in drone technology and what can be done with them. You know, Ambassador Crocker talked about failures of imagination, and I feel like the technological sphere is one where we're seeing failures of imagination most frequently these days. When you look at the kinds of things that we could see with drones domestically, drone swarms were, we've seen drone swarms recently, even in cartel arrests. We've seen them increasingly used just south of the border in Mexico by cartels and organized criminal elements. It's the ability to do something destructive with a drone, something serious, grows constantly as the commercialization of drones becomes more sophisticated. We see this learning curve with all sorts of technology.
And thoughts on what we can do to counter the?
I agree with the legislation that you spoke of. I mean, criminalizing reckless uses of drones. I think giving some thought to areas in which drones cannot be flown. As you all know, drones can't be flown in the capital area. I think in areas where they're thinking about airport routes that airlines fly, and the ways that drones can be used to attack airplanes, and starting to think about how do you regulate this area where we're going to see a proliferation of technologies. One final thing is giving thought to privacy laws with respect to drones, because both in terms of our own personal privacy, but also ability to surveil a target, I think there's a lot of dangers that exist there for assassinations and nefarious uses.
Thank you. To the panel, I know that in response to the ranking member's question on the messaging and such, many of you have mentioned ISIL's successful and continued use of social media to recruit individuals to inflict violence. What more do you feel that tech companies and the administration should be doing to counter these efforts at radicalization, especially inside the United States?
I'm happy to start. I'm sure others will have thoughts as well. I mentioned before a couple of opportunities that I see for the companies to experiment with sharing more information with each other when it comes to terrorism-related content and the accounts associated with that. Maybe I'll mention now also, I think, opportunities to share between government and the tech companies. And I'm no longer privy to where those conversations stand. But it seems to me, much as the government provides in the cyber arena threat information to companies, or when it comes to critical infrastructure threat information, there's an opportunity both for the government to ensure that new trends, new trajectories in how terrorists are utilizing social media platforms and other communications technologies, new techniques, especially those that cross platforms, which any one company is less likely to see, but the government may well see. My hope is that that's a more robust exchange than it has been in the past, and a two-way exchange in which the companies are sharing what they see, because they too, they're in their own pipes. They have a unique insight into what's happening and how users may be changing how they regenerate accounts, for example, or how they link from their various pages or various accounts. And for that dialogue to be in real time, I think would enhance both parties' ability to respond to it, the tech companies and the governments.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel care to comment?
Well, I just think we have to continue what we started, and that is closer cooperation between the United States government and our social media companies. And there's been some success, as I already mentioned in my testimony, with Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, particularly Twitter, who's taken down over a million platforms as a result of that cooperation. We just need to continue that. I think there should be continuous dialogue among our intelligence services, National Security Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, and our social media companies to get the kind of cooperation that's necessary, because as everybody here sitting on this panel knows, radical Islamist organizations are certainly going to continue to use these outlets, given the extraordinary achievement that the ISIS leaders were able to accomplish in very short order, and building an organization and sustaining it largely riding on the waves of technology.
Good. Thank you all. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes General Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all four of you for being here today. I just got to recognize Ambassador Crocker, my professor at National War College in our interagency class, if I remember that right. I also served with him in Iraq, so I know all the folks who've served with you see you as a hero. So it's good to see you here, sir. And he served in the worst spots and the hardest spots in the world, and at our nation's calling. As you all pointed out, ISIS has been attrited to the point where they have no real estate that they control in Iraq, too little portions of real estate in Syria, and we got to continue attriting them. And I think the Secretary of Defense's strategy of not letting them try to retreat to the best of our ability and annihilating them in place is the right strategy there. So we still have some kinetic operations that we have to do. But even if we take down these two pieces of real estate, they're still a threat, and I think you've pointed that out. There'll be a terrorist threat. They could reassert themselves at any point. So we have the military option, but we have to go after their finances. I think you've all done a lot of discussion here about going after their cyber recruiting capability and how they do that. But the one thing that I have not heard, and I really think, getting to my National War College teachings, I don't think we've gotten to the real center of gravity of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other Sunni extremists. It's the ideology. How do we counter this ideology? Because in the end, it's the cyber's a tool, an avenue to transmit that ideology. Finances is a tool. Until we figure out a way to counter this ideology, I don't know that we can really, in the end, declare victory. I'd would welcome any of your all's thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for an excellent question, Congressman. I have to say that had you been posing questions like that when you were at National War College, you would have been a distinguished graduate.
I was close, that close.
It is a key question. I come at this perhaps from a slightly different optic. It's when I look at 100 years of the modern Middle East, I see a successive failure of isms: colonialism, imperialism, monarchism, Arab nationalism, Baathism, Arab socialism, communism in South Yemen. They all have one thing in common. They failed to produce good governance and economic opportunity. Again, Mr. Chairman, those 2 points that you made in your opening statement I think are just key. So they were overcome by the next ism. Now we have Islamism. They are also failing to show that they can govern properly. I see from some press reports that they seem to understand that going in, that a lot of the captured documents we've had access to shows that they were trying to get government moving again. They just ran out of time, money, and luck and became victims of their own hateful ideology. They will yield to something else. Maybe it'll be another run at Islamism. I don't know. But unless that core problem of governance in the region is tackled and improved, you'll just see this over and over and over again. And I would cite one example from my own experience. I was, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, an ambassador 6 times. In 3 of those countries, a predecessor of mine as the American ambassador was assassinated. Ours is inherently a dangerous profession. One of those was in Lebanon. Frank Malloy, the ambassador. He was kidnapped and then executed by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Was that an early Islamist terror group? No. Their ideology was the antithesis of Islam or Judaism or Christianity. They were communists. Was their leader, a closet Islamic radical? Their leader, George Habash, was a Palestinian Christian. So the ideologies may shift and the motivations may shift. We need not to be overly distracted by that, but more focused on what gives them purchase. And what we have seen consistently, it's a failure of governance. And that is a big problem to fix. But as General Keane said, if we don't stay engaged, it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, I think that's a profound question, if I can comment on it. I ended my oral statement and written statement on that very question. You know, we dealt with 2 major ideologies in the 20th century. One was Nazism, fascism, which we destroyed by brute force, and the other was communism, which I think, when you look at it oversimplistically maybe, we beat it with better ideas. And those ideas was democracy and capitalism. And I think that serves as an illustration on how to deal with this. We have to hold this horrific behavior that they demonstrate and their barbarism and killing people. We have to hold them accountable for that. And that means that we have to use the tools of war to punish that behavior and stop it. But we also have to have better ideas. And it gets back to what the ambassador is talking about, and that deals with the issues where that becomes the breeding ground for that. And we have to stay engaged with our allies to help them and help them shape and make certain that they understand, even as Mohammed bin Salman is making transformational changes in Saudi Arabia, we have to stay in that dialogue so they understand how important it is to get this right, to move these societies in the proper direction and move away from political and social injustice and the lack of economic opportunities, and also to achieve stable governance in these countries. And until you do that and provide an alternative, these ideologies will continue to fester and grow.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your time. I'll yield back unless you want to build on anything that was just said. Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. The chair recognizes Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. I guess I have a couple of questions. One concern I have is about the foreign fighters dispersing into other areas. I'm particularly interested in the Sahel area of Africa because I've been in other briefings where it's been brought to my attention that the lack of our presence, the lack of any diplomatic presence, the lack of any sort of relationship-building presence is very dangerous in this area because it's one in which governance is very weak, opportunities are very fruitful, and we're not making the kinds of connections that we should be making to sort of counteract some of this. So I would just like to get your thoughts on it, particularly as it relates to stripping our Department of State from the resources it needs to have a diplomatic presence. And I'll start with you, if you don't mind, Ambassador.
Thank you, ma'am. We are diplomatically represented in all of the countries of the Sahel. We have some assistance programs, but that budget has been under pressure for quite some time, as you know. And there I would just make a short pitch for the third D, defense, diplomacy, and development. USAID can be a very effective agency when it has the resources to do their work. And we're doing great on defense. Diplomacy and development have been seriously underfunded. And that does not make anybody's life any easier.
Can I just like add on to that or carry on that area? So it's not so much guns anymore and blowing up people. It has a lot to do with a new way in which ISIS can be a threat to us, whether or not it's cybersecurity, internet, or whatever. But it's also about relationships or what we can do in regions that help people from their economic perspective not to be so vulnerable to these terrorist groups as well. I don't get the sense that this administration gets that piece substantively about being on the ground, developing the better way of life for those individuals, creating those relationships and understanding those cultural issues. And so I would appreciate it if you would just give me your thoughts on that. All. You can start with you, Ambassador.
Just two quick points. USAID, of course, has an administrator now, Mike Green. Not someone I know personally, but I know his background. And I have colleagues still serving in USAID. He's quite highly regarded in the agency. We have a Secretary of State, as I just said, who starts with an enormous advantage in that building simply because he is not Rex Tillerson. And he does say, and he has done some of the right things there to reassure the institution that he has, that he will support them. So I think we've got some things in place that should yield some good results.
Excuse me, but one of the insecurities of the institution didn't just come from Tillerson, because I don't believe that Tillerson just decided all on his own that he wasn't going to staff the Department of State. I think that he was in a line with whatever it was the president at that time thought was the best thing to do for whatever reason he thinks things are the best thing to do. But perhaps he's changed his position now that Pompeo is the Secretary of State. Is there anyone else that would want to comment on any of this? Thank you.
I would just say that certainly I agree with the ambassador about our diplomatic commitment. The military command that deals with Africa, as you know, is AFRICOM. And our policy is to assist our partner countries in helping to build their military capability. And that is a significant commitment we've made, and it's growing. And when we're doing that, so you should be aware of it, we just don't teach them military skills as part of that partnership that we have. And it doesn't make any difference where we're doing this in the world. We teach them how important it is for the military to submit to civilian control. And also, while we're using weapons of war on a battlefield, we do that in concert with the values of our country. And so those are some of the things that are important to us as we're partnering with them. In terms of the United States taking a direct hand, the only time that we will do that in Africa is when we're dealing with a terrorist organization that we believe could be a threat to the United States outside the region. Then we would attack that ourselves. Otherwise, we want to partner with the host country and bring their military up to a capability where they can deal with the problem.
One thing I'd add to General Keene's comments when it comes to counterterrorism capacity building is that I think this is an interesting area that Congress could look into with respect to the overall strategy of CT capacity building, which is very important. But when you look at the range of the countries involved, like not just the U.S., but you have multiple Western European countries who are doing this, there's an overarching lack of strategy and sometimes even internal lack of coordination where different countries often don't have visibility into what their allies are doing. Sometimes there's not visibility even within the U.S. government. Sometimes there's a lack of coordinated strategy, and there is definitely a lack of consistent monitoring and evaluation metrics being used. So it's an area that is both very important and where I feel that a wise look into how well the system is working could, I think, help to improve it.
Mm-hmm. If I may, just a brief point, drawing from experience at the Justice Department and the National Security Division there, and this really is just to accentuate some of the points others have made about how critical it is to have a robust State Department and State Department presence. Not only does State Department do its own important diplomatic work, not only is it hand in glove, ideally, with the military, but law enforcement assistance and Homeland Security assistance, that often is facilitated by the State Department. So when you get DOJ and FBI training investigators and prosecutors on how to handle terrorism cases, which are distinct and often difficult, when you have DHS reps working with countries on how to monitor their borders better, how to maintain their databases better, how to make those databases exportable to countries like us when we want to see who's traveling here from there, it is often the State Department that makes that sort of collaboration possible, which is, again, another reason that you want that to be a robust presence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and thank you for your answers. I yield back.
General yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the panelists for being here today. I was struck by the remarkable consistency between your comments about ISIS and the ISIS Caliphate being badly damaged but not defeated. And General Keene, I want to start with you because you twice made the comment about when it comes to defeating ISIS, you've talked about the need to drive ISIS out of the footholds that they have in Syria, and I assume those footholds are being fueled by the desperation of the Syrian people, with Assad in power that he's been able to maintain by using Iran and Hezbollah and the IRGC and Russia. So I guess my question is, when we talk about the Salafi jihadi movement and radical Islamist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, do you agree that, at least with respect to Syria, the greatest factor into whether or not it continues to exist or expand and contract is whether or not Assad is in charge in Syria?
Well, first of all, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is a thriving organization in Syria, they're only there because there is a civil war there. And they were drawn to an area, and they were able to establish safe zones and take advantage of the circumstances that are there. So they're absolutely feeding on that. Certainly Assad, a brutal dictator to be sure, you know, the so-called Arab Spring arose, and the people wanted to turn him out. And they were on their way to actually doing that when the Iranians and the Russians successfully intervened and stalemated the situation. And then the Russian military intervention and the Iranian plus-up really changed the entire momentum. Assad is not going anywhere now. I mean, we've got to be honest about it. They have successfully propped up this dictator. What's going on in Geneva is a fantasy. I mean, the Russians and the Iranians may change Assad out because they want another Alawite dictator. But their military intervention has succeeded in indefinitely keeping Assad or somebody like him in power. We have long since squandered the opportunities to do something about that.
And so do you think it is an overstatement then to say that the jihadi movement there, through groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever else may come, will continue as long as Assad reigns over Syria, or someone just like Assad?
Yes, the opposition to Assad is not going to go away either, because they are very committed. You know, they want a secular, most of them a democratic state, some of it an Islamic state. So as long as that continues, that'll give radical Islamists opportunity. And that organization, we didn't talk about it here, but the Al-Qaeda organization, the son of al-Nusra, that operates in Idlib province, is a very dangerous organization, which clearly has objectives to operate outside the region, in Europe, and against the United States. So yes, this is a breeding ground for radical Islam.
So I guess that leads to what is an unpopular topic for a lot of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle when we talk about regime change. But it seems to me that our best option for addressing the threat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and frankly the threat of, as you call it, a hegemonic threat from Iran, and its ability to propagate Hezbollah and groups like that, is a Syria without Assad. And you intimated a little bit about how we would accomplish that. And I know, you know, the Free Syrian Army and arming those, and I've heard the arguments about, well, you're just arming terrorists. You made reference, though, to an Arab NATO earlier, and I'm wondering. I heard John Bolton recently talk about a regional Arab force in the area, and so my question, I guess, first question is: Are you talking about the same thing there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say that I don't believe this administration has a coherent strategy to deal with this problem. And I know for a fact the previous administration certainly did not, and actually, I think, enabled the problem to get worse. And it is a complex problem, as Ambassador Crocker so accurately pointed out. And you can be on either side of this issue and be making what seems to be a very plausible argument, to be frank about it, because it is such a disturbing situation. But in my view, Syria is a strategic anchor for the Iranian hegemonic movement and their ability to encroach on Israel and move out of Syria. And it's also a melting pot for radical Islamists. So I think we should take an interest in what is happening there and try to push back on it. And yes, what I would do is try to control the eastern part of Syria, of the Euphrates River Valley, and I would bring the regional Arab nations in to help do some of that. that gets us back at the bargaining table. In other words, it gives us some political leverage. We're not going to go to Damascus with military force. We're not going to go into Syria with tens of thousands of U.S. forces. There's no political will to do anything quite like that. But there are ways that we can get into have some negotiating leverage if we have some skin in the game, as opposed to just walking away from it.
So you talk about political will, and my time's expired, but this is an important question. I want your perspective. I'd really like it from all of you, and hopefully some other panelists can follow up on it. But when you look at it from the other side of the ledger and political will, when we talk about this issue, do you think that Russia has enough invested that they would ever go to war over Syria?
Russia doesn't want to go to war over Syria, and Russia certainly doesn't want to go to war with the United States over Syria. And we don't need to be intimidated by Russia in Syria. And we long since permitted them to take advantage of us. Secretary Kerry told the Russians, because they were rolling into Syria, do not under any circumstance bomb the Syrian moderates who we were providing aid to by the Central Intelligence Agency. They had anti-tank missiles, and they were a formidable force as a result of that capability. First people the Russians bombed were the Syrian moderates with the anti-tank weapons. And what do we do about that? Nothing. We should have told them right then and there, you do that again, we're going to take down your airfield, and we're going to go after your proxy force on the ground, the Syrian regime. And my judgment, that would not have led to World War III. It would not have led to war with the Russians. They have a limited capability, have never been outside their region in 35 years. They had 30 to 40 airplanes. We dominate that area in terms of military power. They would have backed up. But we had no will. We lacked will.
I appreciate your insights, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence.
Gentleman yields. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here with us today. If we could just go back for just a moment, I know we have talked quite a bit about tech companies and the role that they play. I certainly, as all of you know, that without the social media platforms, ISIS and other groups like them would not have had the opportunity to recruit, train, communicate as well as they have. I know you've talked about, better sharing of information. I know they've taken some of the ISIS-related content down. Also, you talked about international cooperation. If we just could go into some additional steps that tech companies could play to be held more accountable, or what could Congress do to assist and holding them more accountable? And that's to all or any of the witnesses who would like to answer. Thank you.
If you give me enough opportunities, I'll keep adding to my list of things that I think are worth pressing on here. As I mentioned before, I do think while the companies have taken some steps in terms of hash sharing and tool sharing, it's been overwhelmingly focused on ISIS material. And Congresswoman, you mentioned ISIS and other groups like it. And that's a point worth pressing on, I think, as well, because ISIS did, in a sense, revolutionize terrorist radicalization and recruitment online. They weren't the first. Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had used the internet in ways that were novel at the time. But ISIS really took that to another level. But others have learned, of course. Terrorist groups are learning adaptive organizations. And in particular, Al-Qaeda in Syria. And General Keane mentioned them before. I agree with every word of his assessment of them as a real and possibly growing threat. They have changed how they use social media and file upload sites and other platforms online to reach out and recruit and radicalize. But the company's tools, their focus thus far have really been on ISIS. And perhaps that's for good reason. ISIS was inspiring attacks worldwide. But the content from some of those other groups tends to remain up longer than the content from ISIS, and that content is getting more and more worrisome, in my view. It's getting slicker, more sophisticated, and it's always, of course, had a call for violence in it. And so to press the companies on taking the steps they've even made already and rapidly doing what they need to do internally, if that's resourcing, if that's staffing, to apply it to not just al-Qaeda in Syria, whose name changes periodically, but they are fundamentally al-Qaeda in Syria, but also AQAP and also al-Shabaab and also the groups probably yet to come. I think that's an important point, too.
Thank you, Dr. Gardenstein. Ross?
Yes, thank you for that great question, Representative. The first thing I'd like to point to is that I agree with Dr. Geltzer's remarks about al-Qaeda playing the game quite a bit better and allowing their material to stay up longer. I would like to point to, though, that when the big companies focus on taking down material from a group, they're extraordinarily effective. If you look at the percentage of Facebook accounts, jihadist Facebook accounts, that are taken down before they put up a single post, it's massive. And we know what the companies are using. It's artificial intelligence, it's tracking IP addresses, it's tracking associations, but they're very effective. Now, in addition to that, the chairman mentioned my past association with Google. I was a fellow at its think tank, Jigsaw. They have a number of different, very innovative initiatives. One thing they did was called the redirect method, which took people who were looking for ISIS propaganda materials and had a very ISIS-looking ad that then redirected them to a playlist with very neutral-looking but anti-ISIS materials. That's a project I worked on with them. I think that talking to organizations like Jigsaw about the really interesting initiatives they have would be both helpful and enlightening for members of Congress and the administration. So this brings me to kind of the key point that I'd have, which is when you look at well-resourced organizations like Facebook or Google or Twitter, they're able to do this well, and they have a fair, at least when their eye is focused on the ball, they have a fair sense of what their obligations are. But smaller tech companies are constantly arising. They're players in the space, and they don't necessarily have either the capabilities or the will to do what they need to remove this material. So I think a dialogue about both what Congress's role with respect to smaller companies and also what larger companies like Facebook, like Google, like Twitter, what their role should be in helping to enhance the capabilities and the set of standards for smaller companies will be very helpful. And in my time in Silicon Valley, I've had dialogues with people who work for some of the larger companies, and they feel that this exact initiative is needed.
Thank you. Ambassador or General?
I don't have anything to add to
Okay.
those excellent comments.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Gallagher, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Geltzer, in your testimony, you talk about the fact that we have lost our key counterterrorism partner on the ground in Syria, the Kurds. Now, we do still have a 60,000-strong Syrian Democratic Force, which our special operators are working with, many of which are Kurds. But I think your broader point is well taken, which is to say it's hard to support those forces when they're under assault from the Turks. And at a time when our interests seem to be converging with the Israelis and the Sunni Arab Gulf states, Turkey is an outlier. And it's hard for me to make sense of Syria without somehow getting the Turks to play a more productive role. So I'd just be interested in your assessment and the assessment of the panel of what do we do with respect to Turkey? What are our leverage points? And how can we, as you rightly lay out, protect our Kurdish partners on the ground at the same time?
Thank you, Congressman Gallagher. Grateful for the question. It's a hard balance. Partly we marvel in the coalition that the United States has largely put together to execute this campaign, and partly the breadth of that coalition creates exactly the sort of problems that you identify, and those problems will only get exacerbated as the conflict evolves from the original one that brought together that coalition. In terms of how to keep Turkey in the fight, which we need it to be, NATO partner, Incirlik air base, critical to our counter-ISIS operations, while at the same time getting Turkey to back off the Syrian Kurds. That strikes me as an effort, partly just sheer attention. The relationship that was built between a number of folks at the highest levels of our government and a number of folks, their counterparts in Ankara, was one of almost constant dialogue, so that there were no surprises, that there was an understanding that before, in particular, the Syrian Kurds were moving to a certain place, there was a sense of what their objectives would be there, what weapons they would have from us there, and how we would ensure that those weapons, as best we could, did not get into the hands of others associated with the Kurds who are of concern to Ankara, for good reason. And it seems at some point that that dialogue broke down, and the type of assurance, truly daily at times, about where weapons were going and when the next operation against the next city would wrap up and what the pause would look like, was either no longer being communicated or at least no longer being believed. I think as with a lot of diplomacy, the best solution is high-level attention again. Probably visits from some of our most senior folks to there to get back on track, to get the assault on the Afrin Kurds off the table so that the Kurds can move away from Afrin and to the Euphrates River Valley and take out the remnants of ISIS there.
Sure. Dr. Gardenstein-Ross, I don't know if you...
Yeah, Representative Gallagher, I think that Turkey is a big concern, right? In addition to their military assault into Afrin, you have a slide towards authoritarianism within the country that we can all see. You have the scaling back of Ataturk's legacy and the scaling back of secularism in the country. And you have something which has been well reported, including in the Washington Post, which is support for some of the nastier and more radical elements of the Syrian fighters, including the ability of some known al-Qaeda operatives to pass through Turkey's border and to operate within Turkey. I think all of this is a concern. I agree with Dr. Geltzer about the need for ongoing dialogue, and I think that we need to do this with our eyes open about the fact that problems in that country are escalating from the perspective of U.S. national interests.
Sure. General Kane?
Yeah, certainly we do have challenges here. You know, the Turkish leadership certainly wanted Assad to go, and were very frustrated with the United States because we were playing such a weak hand in Syria, largely due, I think, because we saw the Iranian intervention and what they were trying to achieve, and we didn't want to rattle them in terms of the nuclear deal that was on the table and negotiations that were taking place. Turkey also facilitated the growth of ISIS on their border openly, and Turkey also facilitated the growth of al-Qaeda because they strategically thought that those two radical groups would contribute to the removing Assad from power. That turned out not to be the case for ISIS, to be sure. I also think that we made a strategic mistake in the United States military when we sided with the Syrian Kurds. I think it made sense tactically. They had will, they had skill, but growing that capacity when they're not interested truly in dealing with Arab lands and all the way down into southeastern part of Syria, and then what they're really interested in is carving out some territory for themselves in northern Syria, much to the detriment of our relationship with Turkey over this issue. I think we should back away from them, to be frank about it. And I think that the relationship with Turkey, despite the Islamic nature of the country, they are a NATO country, they do matter. They have a significant military capacity that we have to value, and we're using their air base. I think we got to get back in the game with Turkey with some reasonable geopolitical expectations of what we want to achieve in Syria, which does not include a large dependency on the Syrian Kurds.
And I've run out of time. I apologize, Ambassador Crocker. So maybe, I don't know if we end up with more time afterwards. I'll revisit this and also want to argue with Dr. Geltzer about one more thing. So.
Great points. General Lee from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee is recognized.
Let me thank the chairman and the ranking member, particularly for insightful comments that have been made, and thank the witnesses. Each of you are serving your nation in a very important time. And I, too, have known General Kane, first of all, in the series of work that he has done, and note that he was at the Pentagon on 9/11, that it must have been an experience that he will never want to repeat, never forget. But we thank you for your service on that very tragic, heinous day. Ambassador, of course, we have crossed paths so many times in Iraq, Pakistan, and I believe Afghanistan. It just looks like we've seen each other, and you have certainly well deserved of the honor that was given to you. So let me just be very quick and say democracy is good, but sometimes the inconsistency of our policies here in the United States can be very challenging. Elections come and policies come and go. And so in your comments, I'd appreciate your thoughts about how that influences, but I'd like you to comment on some holistic perspectives, and that is the inconsistent policy, Ambassador, with Pakistan, the willingness to sanction Pakistan for what seems to be incompatibility or lack of appreciation of any work that they're doing with the Taliban in Afghanistan, putting things on that those of us that work with Pakistan have to put out the fire. The issue of foreign fighters who now don't have maybe a foreign fight, though I believe that terrorism is franchised. Where are these 120,000 plus or others? Obviously, some lost in the battle. Where are these foreign fighters, and how do we have to look at that? And three, this is Homeland Security, but I think we're interrelated with the State Department on the issues that we have. So if you can comment on the technology end, what policy does the government need to have in speaking to our tech community and saying, we need you to be as vigilant constantly as you have been, and maybe you need to embrace the small companies to help them out as well. Ambassador and General Kane, if you would.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It's a very important issue, our relationship with Pakistan, and it's worth spending a couple of minutes on. We are a great nation. We are a great people. We do have our weaknesses. One of them is we don't care about history. That's history as a pejorative for most Americans. Well, history in this region, history defines today and predicts tomorrow, and we're ignorant at our cost. Important here because the Pakistanis have their own version of their history and our history with them. They will recall that after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that we allied ourselves very closely with Pakistan. The anti-Soviet jihad was staged out of Pakistan's northwest frontier province, organized by us, with Pakistan as an absolutely critical partner. But once the Soviets were defeated, we decided our work there was done, even though we could see the Afghan Civil War coming, which it did in all its horror. So not only did we pull out, we no longer needed Pakistan anymore, so we stopped requesting waivers to the Pressler Amendment, which called for the cessation of all economic or military assistance to any country pursuing a nuclear weapons program. For a decade, the administration got a waiver for that. We didn't need Pakistan anymore, no more waivers, and they were completely sanctioned as far as any assistance from us went. And then the Civil War broke out on their border. When the Taliban started to show some purchase, yep, the Pakistanis went in on that because it looked like that might be the one group that could stop that civil war before it crossed their border. So where have we been post 9/11? Well, we're back. The Pakistanis ask themselves, well, that's great. When are you leaving again? Because that's what you Americans do. I spent 3 years there. It's an imperfect relationship, goodness knows, and the Pakistanis do a lot of things that are bad for us and bad for themselves. But a country of 185 million people, nuclear weapons, I think we have to be careful how we see and use that relationship. In essence, what the Pakistanis are saying, or said to me, was, if you think we are going to go after the Taliban in Pakistan, turn them into a mortal enemy of ours, as you get set to leave, because that's what you'll do, you're going to leave, and then we'll have that existential threat. If you think we're going to do that, you're completely crazy. So I would have liked to have seen the administration say, as the president did, that we're no longer driven by the calendar in Afghanistan. We're driven by conditions. We have important national security interests. We're going to be there to protect them with the force that we need at the time. To then have said to the Pakistanis, you worry about us going? We're not going this time. We've just made it clear. It's about conditions. So isn't it time to rethink your own strategic logic? And oh, by the way, while you're thinking that through again, you remember what happened to Mohammed Akhtar Mansour, Mullah Omar's successor, killed with a U.S. military drone strike inside Pakistan. That while you're working it out, any Taliban leader we can find, we're going to pop him. Maybe it'll be in Balochistan, maybe it'll be in Rawalpindi. So why don't you take those two elements and see if you want to develop a different strategic logic. That is not what we did. So once again, we are in this confrontational relationship with Pakistan over Afghanistan largely. It is not going to take us anywhere good. But again, that failure to demonstrate strategic patience hurts us very greatly there and really elsewhere in the region and indeed in the world.
Yes, I certainly agree and associate myself with everything the ambassador said. Listen, we created so many of these problems for ourselves. We're 17 years, involved in this war in Afghanistan, and largely due to protraction of the wars, largely due to our own policy decisions. Because very quickly after the Taliban were deposed, as we know, we made a decision to go into Iraq, and that immediately made the war in Afghanistan as what we call in the military economy of force. Actually, they were put on a diet. And that was from 2002, that's when we started taking resources away, all the way till 2008. That was the first time we put any substantive resources back into Afghanistan, and that's because the surge had succeeded in Iraq, and we were able to reduce our forces, and we finally had capacity again. So this protraction has been due to our policy, and I think President Obama had the right idea to do a surge in Afghanistan, but unfortunately he pulled that forces out after 15 months, and that was a tragic mistake. So that has what has given this pause to the Pakistanis who are harboring two safe havens of the Afghan Taliban inside their country. And that also leads to the protraction of the war. For the first time now, we've had a president who has said, I'm committed to see this thing through. But that is going to take more than rhetoric. There are going to have to be some real commitment here. And we may have to adjust the force levels and other capacity levels based on the conditions that are taking place in that country and have the flexibility. And we also have to keep the American people engaged and explain why is this important to us. And we don't do a very good job of that. President Bush didn't do a very good job of it. President Obama didn't do a very good job of it. And I'm hoping this president will see the need to do that. And why Afghanistan matters and why we don't want it to become a safe haven for terrorists again from which to attack our allies and also the American people.
Jill Lay yields back. I believe Congressman Gallagher had a brief wrap-up question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've inherited General Perry's time, so I'll try and channel him with this one. So, Dr. Gelser, I think if I understand your argument, it's that what you call anti-Muslim and an anti-Muslim travel ban, the risk is that it would alienate key Muslim communities in the Middle East that we need to participate in the fight against ISIS, right? But I guess, so my question is indeed that happening, and how would we know, right? What is our metric for alienation? I mean, I perceive there to be, at least among leadership in key Sunni Muslim countries, a closer relationship between this administration and the last.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak to that. So I probably worry most about the communities right here. I think there are communities here that have been fairly outspoken in saying that the travel ban, among other policies, but very much at the heart of those policies, feels to them to target them. And in fact, I think they have good reason to feel that way, given how it has been framed as a campaign promise and now delivered on as a presidential policy. And those communities strike me as the ones that have an opportunity to intervene with those who might be prone to radicalization or even radicalizing in ways that we would all like to see, ideally before those sorts of individuals become on the law enforcement route. If you talk to FBI, they take no pleasure in finding teenagers who are on the road to material support, trying sometimes to dissuade them or their parents from staying on that path and ultimately doing what FBI should do, which is if they've committed a crime, arresting them and charging them for it. But ideally, communities can find ways to intervene sooner than that, and a number of studies have shown what's called the bystander effect, that in something like 70 to 80% of cases, those who are on the radicalizing path give some indication of that to those who know them well, their family, their teacher, their community members. But if you alienate those communities, I'm not sure they feel prone to intervene in those ways, or ultimately in the ways that you might need by simply calling law enforcement. I do think the overseas communities are important too. It is hard to get the data on exactly how foreign communities react to U.S. domestic policies, but it would seem, at a minimum, unlikely to appeal to them to have this religion-centric approach to filtering those who come to this country, rather than the very, very careful individualized vetting of which I'm fully supportive and that I think should always be strengthened to ensure that we're using all of our intelligence to stop threats from entering our borders.
I've pressed my luck with time, so Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses for a very enlightening discussion. And Ambassador, you mentioned failures of imagination, and a good friend of mine, Admiral Inman in Austin, I know worked with the 9/11 Commission to coin that phrase. Not to plug my book, but I wrote a book called Failures of Imagination to talk about what we have to imagine, what the threats could be and what keeps us up at night. And no, it's been a great discussion, and I want to thank all of you for being here today. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. And without objection, this committee stands adjourned.